So let's now use this expense data model to create some dummy expenses here in our expenses widget, or the expenses state class to be precise, so that we can then output these dummy widgets here in this list before we then later will of course also add the logic to create expenses ourselves. But we'll start with some dummy expenses so that we have something to output. And for that, in this expenses state class here, I'll add a new final list of expenses. So of using this custom expense class as a type here, because as you learned before, whenever you create a class, you automatically also get a type of the same name, which simply contains information regarding the shape of the objects that will be created with help of your class later. And here I'll name this variable, this property in this expenses state class, which I create here, registered expenses. And I'll set it equal to a list with square brackets. And now here, I simply want to create a couple of dummy expenses by using our expense class and instantiating objects with help of this class. And here we now have to pass in these different pieces of information, like for example, the title of this expense. And here I'll give this first dummy expense a title of Flutter course, and add an amount of, let's say, $19.99, and set the date to today. I'll keep it simple and simply use today as a date. And you can create new date objects, because keep in mind that date wants date time values, so date objects in the end, with help of this date time type which we used before, which is actually not just a type but also a class built into Dart, as you can tell. And you can use datetime to create new dates by passing in various pieces of information here to the constructor function, or by simply using the special now constructor function by using datetime now. And this simply uses today and now as a date time, so as the date and time that will be stored for this expense. So with that, I'm passing in all that information. Of course, we now also need to set the category though. And this can now be set with help of our enum, which is available here, since I am already importing from this expense.dart file. My IDE, my code editor, automatically added that import before when I first referenced my expense class type here, but you can also add it manually. But with that file imported, we also have access to the enum, since that is defined in the same file. And we can use that here for creating our expense by referring to that enum and then using the dot notation to access the different predefined values that make up this enum. And here we could, for example, assign a category of work to this first expense, and then copy this expense and quickly create a second dummy expense here, which could be named cinema. And maybe here we paid $15.69. I'll also use today as a date to keep things simple, but the category here would of course be leisure. And with that, we have two dummy expenses which we can use. Now, right now, I'm getting a hint here that I'm not using registered expenses, but that will change because the next step now is to output those expenses in a list. And that's what we'll do in the next lecture.